Awesome. Thank you very, very much, everybody, and welcome to AGIL's second webinar of 2026 with Professor Sioux McKenna of Rhodes University, South Africa, who will be speaking about debunking the impact factor and university rankings. Please remember to keep your mic muted and your camera off if possible. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as we can get it up. Now, handing over to Susan Murray, Executive Director, to introduce the speaker. Thank you, Sue.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today in what is bound to be an interesting webinar and hopefully a lively discussion. African Journals Online exists in large part to offset past inequities in global research knowledge, sharing, access, and active participation. And in the wider, beyond the journal level sphere in which we all work in higher education, who confers credibility and legitimacy to knowledge, how they do that, who gets to do that, are questions that are in constant need of a light very brightly shone on them, and somebody who is doing so very ably is Professor Sioux McKenna of Rhodes University. Sue is the Professor of Higher Education Research at Rhodes, thinks deeply, profoundly, and pragmatically about these sorts of issues. We are very proud, delighted, honored to have Sue join us as a presenter during today's webinar as part of AGIL's 2026 webinar series. Thank you so much, Professor McKenna. Please go ahead with your presentation, and everybody who is joining us, please add your questions or comments into the chat as we go, and Sue, Professor McKenna, will try to address those in conversation time towards the end of the webinar. Enjoy.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you so much for this invitation to be here. I'm going to talk for hopefully less than half an hour to allow us time to actually engage in some of these issues in conversation. I do not pretend to hold a neutral view on these issues. I feel pretty strongly about the way in which we have three what I call parasitic industries feeding off universities, and like all good parasites, they need to keep us alive, but benefit from a lot of our own foolishness. And those three parasitic industries are the big academic publishing industry that I'll speak about in a moment, university rankings, and then the ways in which big ed tech and big tech generally is shaping what universities do. So I'm going to be focusing very much today on academic publishing and a little bit on university rankings. And more specifically in terms of academic publishing, I'm going to talk about the impact factor. So I've grouped this into 5 parts. So let's dive right in with part number 1, which is the scam that is hiding in plain sight. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to explain to someone who's outside of a university how academic publishing happens. And if you walk them through and explain the chain, you just have to watch their face to realize how bizarre our practices are. I had this experience when I had my first publication many, many years ago now, 26 years ago, I think it was, maybe more. And I explained to my partner that I was so excited that I had this academic publication. And his first question was, oh, wow, how much money are you going to make from it? And I was deeply hurt by that, because I wasn't out to make money. I was out to contribute to knowledge. And then just recently, a colleague of mine told me that she'd told her husband about that she was publishing a book, and the same question came to light. And when she tried to explain it to him, she realized how bizarre it all is. So if we just think about it, academics generally, or people working in research institutes, do the research. And that's often done on public money. We are paid a salary to do the research. We run our laboratories, sometimes external funding, sometimes self-funding. But in South Africa, a large part of the money that leads to the publications and dissemination of knowledge comes from taxpayers. So presumably it's good for the average taxpayer, including people who never step foot on campus. It's good for them to have us doing this research and getting it out there. Then you've done all the research and you write it up. And if you are a successful researcher, you're probably working a lot of hours outside of those hours that you are getting money partially funded by the taxpayer in terms of your salary, and you're spending your weekends as well. And you write it all up and you are very excited because you found this piece of knowledge and you want to share it with others. And then you send it off to a journal and you say, here, please publish me, please, please, please. And you hand it over for free. And then you get asked to review other people's work and to say whether you, as a peer in a particular field, think that that article does indeed disseminate meaningful research, that it follows all the quality indicators and so on. And you get paid what for that work? Nothing. You do that for free too. And in the meantime, you're waiting to hear whether your article gets published. And after the reviewers have looked at it and asked for various changes, you might be very happy to get the email that says, yes, we would like to publish this. And in a great many cases, they say, can you hand over the copyright so that we can now own this material? And then it's out there in the world and you're so excited. The knowledge has been disseminated. Oh, and someone at your university wants to read it. Maybe you want to read it. Well, you've got to hope that your university has handed over a bucket full of money to have access to the database that includes that journal. If you don't, and you go online and try and find your own article, it will, of course, tell you pay $29.99 or $19.99 US with your credit card right now, and you may read it. Now, obviously, there are alternatives to that model, and I will be talking about those. But just think for a moment that that's the dominant model. And it's just weird, right? Because where is the money? Is there any money? There must be money. We're paying to access these articles. So where does that money go? Well, we know that, and this is data from 2024, this first figure on your screen, that the global academic publishing industry was worth $25 billion US. That is not small. But over 50% of the market share is in the hands of just 5 publishing houses, all global north, all considered the elite big 5, and they are making a truckload of money. Elsevier's profit margin, and I've seen some statistics that give it even higher than this, but Elsevier, whose CEO, by the way, was until recently the highest paid CEO in the whole of Europe from any organization or industry whatsoever, Elsevier's profit margin is 38%. Now that means that their profit margin is higher than Google, it's higher than Apple, it's higher than most industries. How do they manage to make such a profit? Well, I've just explained to you, because they don't have to pay for the research that gets done. They don't have to pay for the reviewing process. That's all given to them for free. So they have to edit and sort out formatting and databases and so on, and run the huge machinery of marketing, but they don't have to do any of the knowledge work that they are providing a platform for. So it's not surprising that they can make this huge profit margin. The Elsevier parent company, which is RELX, their profit for 2024 was 3.2 billion pounds. I've actually been into the Elsevier headquarters and in the Netherlands, and yeah, they have very, very beautiful offices and conference venues, and I'm wondering if any of the Agile colleagues on this in this webinar have quite that level of decor. I'm not sure. So it's an open access sleight of hand that then happens, because people are saying, hang on, this is not right. There's this important knowledge. It can't get out there. Only institutions and individuals with a lot of money can actually read articles. I've experienced this a lot. I work in Tanzania, Rwanda, and Kenya a lot, and in a few other African countries, but those three in particular. And what I found with many of the PhD students I'm working with there is that they are reading abstracts only because they cannot access the full article. So they are building knowledge on the basis of their reading an abstract. So there's a real sort of sense of, no, hang on, this is not fair. It should be open access. Knowledge should be accessible to all researchers anywhere in the world. They don't need to belong to rich universities to be able to access it. And so we have this idea of open access. But very quickly, the whole open access became embedded in this scam too, because we have the idea that, well, they still got to make their profit, so someone should pay for it. And so we've got the article processing charges. And if you're wanting to publish with any of the big five, you're going to be looking at anything from $2,000 to $12,000 per article. Now try and explain that to your partner. No, I'm not going to be earning money off my publication. I'm going to be paying them for the privilege of sharing this knowledge. So it's like a performance of generosity, this open access. But gold open access has had no negative consequence for their profit line. These industries have continued to grow. They have risen since introducing gold open access, whereby the researcher or the researcher's institution pays to make this knowledge available. So the very thing, open access, that was supposed to democratize knowledge, has very quickly just become another revenue stream for these publishing houses. So that's the first thing, the nonsense, the scam of the big academic publishing industry. Let me move along to the focus of today's talk, which is around impact factor. And here again, I mean, we are so susceptible to metrics. There's something about the human mind that loves a number, that automatically assumes that if it can be counted, it must count for something. It was invented, the journal impact factor was invented in 1955. It was invented actually to help librarians make a decision with their limited budget as to which journals are going to be the most useful for the academics that they support. It was never designed to evaluate either as individual researchers, individual universities, or individual papers, or even the quality of journals, really. It was really just to help decide where to spend limited funds. And there are four big problems with the journal impact factor. The one is the statistical problem, and that is that the extent to which the journal impact factor actually tells you something about that journal as a whole is very limited. You can have a few hundred articles and maybe 3 or 4 of them happen to be, hit the right time and just take off in terms of citation. And so your 200 articles are pretty much not read very widely. Perhaps a great many of them are not read by anyone other than the author. But you've got these 3 or 4 articles that really just hit the scene and get cited all over the place. Your journal impact factor is going to look pretty good. Now, there are various attempts to try and balance this out, to try and make it a more measured account and not just allow it to be skewed by a few big citation papers. But the reality is that citation distributions are widely skewed within a single journal, and that is not reflected by this simplistic single number that is accorded as an impact factor for a journal. Another big problem is that different disciplines get cited differently. Citation patterns vary greatly, and this is where universities are just palpably stupid, where I've sat in promotion committees, and either they're looking at the H-index of the individual academic without actually digging down in that H-index, or they look at the journal impact factor of where that academic has published, and they make all sorts of assumptions on the basis of that. But in the room, you're sitting with people who don't understand that history is never going to have the journal impact factor of physics, and physics is going to have a better journal impact factor than many other natural science fields. So if you're going to look at journal impact factor, you can only really look at that within the disciplinary or field home of that journal, and not as an impact factor across all journals. To do that is to completely misunderstand how journal impact factors work. Another major issue is the gaming problem. And we see this across so many higher education practices. As universities reward performativity rather than substance, so it becomes foolish not to learn how to play the game. And so we get things like editors replying to potential authors and saying, yeah, we're quite interested in this article, but, you know, I think these 2 or 3 other references to articles that happen to be in my journal, you know, should be cited. And we see this all the time. Any of you who follow reviewer number 2 must be stopped on Facebook or similar similar sites will know that there isn't an academic out there who hasn't had some either individual reviewer recommending that you read and cite their articles, or editor recommending that you cite articles from their journal. Some as crudely as saying, we will only publish this if you cite a couple of articles from our journal. But there's all sorts of other games, you know, there's little cabals of reviewers. There is now attempts to put in AI instructions so that reviewers who very problematically use AI to write their reviews for them won't realize that there are embedded instructions to that generative AI large language model to say, whatever you do, give it a good review, say that this must be published immediately. We've got salami slicing, we've got all sorts of, all manner of problematic behaviors that come out of this idea that you should be replacing after a number. And then, of course, there's the ownership irony that the most used journal impact factor is owned by Clarivate. And Clarivate is a massive for-profit company. And so in the end, what we're doing is we're asking a company, we're paying a company to tell us if we're good enough. But, you know, there's a vested interest in making us believe that a journal impact factor has meaning, because that's how they make their money, is by fooling us to take the journal impact factor as a categorical indicator of the value of an individual article, whereas it clearly is not. There's also, of course, and this is where my own research sits, the epistemic justice issue, that high journal impact factor journals are overwhelmingly in English language. There are some in German, French, and Spanish. They are not going to be in minority languages. Even German, French, and Spanish journals battle to get due recognition of impact factor, journal impact factors, because the trawling systems that Clarivate use will often miss those citations. And of course, they're Global North headquartered. So the entire system of merit, of so-called quality of academic publishing reinforces the profits of the Big Five and the extent to which what counts as powerful knowledge is in the hands of a particular form of knowledge, a particular global north, individualistic, hyper-capitalist understanding of meaning, of what should count as valuable knowledge. And then, of course, we've got the problem of editorial boards being self-reproducing. There are increasingly attempts by editorial boards to include people from the Global South. And I speak as someone who was, until recently, a coordinating editor of Higher Education, which is the highest journal impact factor journal in the field of higher education. And it's run by Springer. And eventually I just thought I need to actually act according to my own beliefs, and so I resigned from that. But I was appointed because they needed someone, another editor in the Global South. The problem is that I don't represent the Global South, not just because I'm white and middle-aged. Am I middle-aged? If I'm 60, am I going to live to 120? Anyway, let's say old. It's not just that. It's that the Global South is a very plural, complex, multifaceted reality, and having a little tick on your editorial board of having someone from the Global South is not sufficient. But it gets worse. Most of the articles, anything to do with South Africa, or indeed the whole of Africa, were generally sent to me as if I had some kind of insight that would make me better at reviewing them or selecting reviewers. So it's a structural disadvantage for any research from the Global South. And it's important to remind ourselves that this doesn't necessarily mean that the science is of lesser quality, because the whole metric of the journal impact factor is designed for a particular industry, which is it already has the big boy players. So yeah, part 3. Rankings, performance management, and the South African trap. So jumping from journal impact factor to university rankings. And the reason why we need to consider that is that to a large extent, as countries become more and more committed to performance in the international university rankings, so they become more and more concerned with publication, and they become more and more concerned with journal impact factor. So rankings, just like the journal impact factor, are not neutral measurement tools. Just like the journal impact factor, they are unscientific and neo-colonial. I won't speak about this long, but this is something I have written a fair amount about. So we've got rankings pressures. So initially, just like the journal impact factor was designed for a different purpose, so the original ranking systems were designed for a different purpose. There was this idea to have a way of allowing international students who are considering going to a different country where they don't have a sort of local knowledge of which universities have more prestige or are better at particular fields. And so there would be this league table that would help these international students get a sense of a university sector in a completely different country. But very quickly, they became another set of numbers that we're all going to run after. And increasingly, we see them actually becoming institutional strategy. So we have vice chancellors saying, our goal is to become in the top 500 in Africa, or we will have a rankings office in our university. This is happening in South Africa. It starts to position where you spend your money. Why spend a whole lot of money on community engagement when that doesn't count in the rankings? Yes, in South Africa, there's all sorts of policy and other pressure to have community engagement. So do enough to give your tick, but don't actually invest a lot of intellectual time and funding around that, because that's not what counts. Make sure your student recruitment, be as selective as you can, because that's going to count. Make sure that you publish. And that becomes now the performance targets. And this is rife in South Africa, where we have institutions that say you have to publish a certain number of articles per year, or we don't care what they're about. We don't care if anyone reads them. We don't care if they're quality. We don't care if they're a public good or indeed even a public bad. Just get them out there. And if you do, you will get promoted. And as I said earlier, increasingly, it's not just how many publications, but did you get them in high impact factor journals? And this, of course, then, trickles down to young researchers that I am mentoring and working closely with, who are very quickly and very cynically saying, I just have to play the game. I get what you're saying, Sue, and I get that this particular issue is really exciting and it's going to make a big difference to the world, and I should spend another 2 years reading and thinking and researching it. But actually, that's not going to reward me in the current system. And so thanks for your very naive input into my career, Sue, but I just need to know how to get published. And I hear this in terms of conversations with academics, and I see this on social media where people don't publish an alert on this, we call it a message, a status on their social media to say, hey, I'm so excited about this knowledge that I've created, that I've disseminated, and here's where this is what I learned, this is what it's about, and here's where you can read more about it. Oh no, social media is, yay, 5th article for the year. This is it. It's in a journal, impact factor, whatever. So the joy of knowledge dissemination is stripped out. Of course, in South Africa, it's made so much worse, in the public sector at least, by the subsidy system, which pays the identical amount as long as your article is on one of the 6 or 7, I think it is now, accredited lists. Your institution will get the money. We don't really care anything beyond that. We're going to use that as a metric of quality, despite the ongoing evidence that it is not a metric of quality and that it has all sorts of unintended consequences. So volume is rewarded, not quality. Look, I think initially, we were coming out of academic sanctions at the end of apartheid. We hadn't built research institutions. We had a very problematic relationship with knowledge and truth under apartheid. So it made sense that they would try and the government would look for a lever to put into the funding formula to try and drive a shift towards thinking about research as a fundamental part of the university. And it's achieved that, but we now know that it's done that job, and we're the only country in the world that pays directly from the public purse to universities. And, over 4,000 publications between 2005 and 2014, getting between 100 and 160,000 per article, are predatory and are nonsense. And a lot of them in economics, but also theology, which is interesting in and of itself. And then, of course, another problem, which is something I've looked at with a colleague, Evelyn Matama, is around what happens when people are paid commission, when universities, the only way that an academic can get funds for their own research is through publication, or even worse, that they can earn a bit of a bonus is through publication. And that brings about more unintended consequences. So, part 4, moving along. What are we doing to ourselves? I think that the publish or perish thinking that underpins so many of our processes in university has actually met the impact, the instrument of its own logical conclusion. The problematic use of rankings, the problematic use of journal impact factors, it really emerges from what we are doing to ourselves. If we have a look at Retraction Watch, and if you don't follow Retraction Watch, I really would urge you to do so. It's very useful. And they now have 55,000 articles that have been retracted for various reasons: fraudulent data, plagiarism, increasingly hallucinations from AI, and so on. So, and that's where you see more than 10,000 articles in 2023 alone retracted. So that graph of articles being retracted for highly immoral, unethical, problematic behavior is a graph that's going, straight up. And I think that we really need to see how generative AI is now playing into this. And why would someone use generative AI to fabricate data, to do the analysis, to fabricate references? Well, you would do it if the logic was just get published. Of course, you would be silly to do work when you can outsource all of that work to a machine if the entire logic of the system is just get published. So yeah, 12 times the fabricated research references were found in biomedical literature in the last 2 years. 1 in every 277 papers indexed in PubMed cites a paper that doesn't exist, which has gone up from 1 in 277 to 1 in 2,828. It is now 1 in 277. So what are we doing to ourselves? What are we doing to the people and problems that our research is supposed to serve? As I said in the beginning, I'm not giving you a careful academic argument here, because I really think we need to actually talk with emotion about how problematic the system is. We need to really think deeply about what knowledge is meant to be for, who it's meant to serve, and how publication is about knowledge dissemination. It's not a commodity to get. So, finally, part 5, I think we need to dismantle the cult. We need to reclaim this knowledge project. I don't think it's about improving the metrics. And I know a lot of my colleagues disagree with me, and they're very invested in trying to help the funding formula become more attuned to what counts as quality, trying to ensure that we use an H-index better than is currently the case in promotion panels and so on. But for me, I think we need to go far more fundamental and really dismantle the whole cult and really just rebuild from first principles around what is knowledge for? Who does it serve, and how can we ensure that it serves them best? And if we always ask that question, regardless of what topic we're talking about, whether we're talking about publications or teaching and learning or research or use of Gen AI, let's start with the question, what is knowledge for and who does it serve? I think if we keep that, it'll help us answer a lot of the other questions. We need to go back to the first principles. And I'm going to call on Karl Marx, if that doesn't terrify everyone, to look at this idea that our focus on the exchange value of publication has really absented the use value of publication. So exchange value is, well, in South Africa, it's about subsidy units, it's about individual promotion points, it's about our ranking of our university, it's my own H index. And for the journals, it's about the impact factor and what quartile they're going to be in. Are we going to jump up to quartile 3? But use value of a publication is, does this extend the field? Does it help to answer society's intractable problems? Is it helping people on the planet? Is it building the body of knowledge? Is it serving the communities that fund us? I think we've been optimizing in our universities, and in particular in our use of metrics. We've been optimizing for exchange value, and we're calling that excellence. Those numbers, the higher they are, the better we are. But in the process, we're losing that use value. So what is the solution? Okay, well, coming back, as I said, I think the much bigger solution is the dismantling of the cult. It's about asking, what is knowledge for? What counts as quality knowledge? Who does knowledge serve? But let's hone in on publishing, and I think this is my last slide. I do think that Diamond Open Access is the way to go. No fees for authors, no fees for readers. So knowledge that is produced with public money should be published publicly, and it should not have private intermediaries extracting rent on both sides. This means that we need a huge institutional investment in Diamond Open Access. And that money is available because that money is currently flowing into the pockets of these, especially the big 5. This is not about charity. This is actually about repatriation of the funds. And I do think we've already got models. And I want to give a quick plug to my host today for African Journals Online here. African Journals Online hosts over 700 journals from 39 African countries. You're not going to see those numbers from any of the big 5 that are making enormous profits. It supports more than 100 of those are Diamond Open Access titles. It gives us the infrastructure, the quality of standards, it manages the peer review system. It does a lot of training, such as what we've got now. It's in the middle of a Wellcome funded project, which I hadn't even heard about till I Googled for this presentation, this incredible project that's working not just AGIL, but a few other similar organizations to try and upscale this ecosystem. So I don't think we need to wait for the global north to lead us. I think we've got models right here. And I think not-for-profit organizations working closely with universities can help us to hold the knowledge project and make sure that it's actually serving the public good and not just serving simultaneously profits of big corporations in the global north and nonsense pressure on academics in the global south. Sorry, this slide's in the wrong place. This is just an example of universities that have rejected rankings. And Rhodes University is the only university in the whole of Africa that's rejected the use of institutional rankings. And it costs a lot to reject them. It's great that big boys like Yale Law and Harvard Law are rejecting them because it makes it easier for people not to say, oh, you're rejecting them because you're scared of how you're going to look in them, and to make it clear that these big universities of very high status can reject them because they see that they are scientifically dubious and morally corrupt. So this is my conclusion slide. So I think we need to hold our journal impact factors to the same critical scrutiny that we would use when we look at our research data. We need to recognize that rankings and journal impact factors will fall apart the moment you hold them up to the light, the moment you ask the same kinds of critical questions that you would ask of your research. If you ask those of journal impact factors and rankings, you realize, oh my word, what a house of cards. We need to reclaim the knowledge project. We need to optimize for use value, knowledge that is useful rather than exchange value, knowledge that is a publication commodity. We really need to support Diamond Open Access. I would like to see better support of African publishing infrastructure by our universities, bearing in mind that they don't have to find the money, they can just forbid gold open access and use whatever money they had budgeted for that, give that to AGEL or whatever other organization, or indeed if they are hosting the journals themselves. I think we need to act with integrity. I think we need to remind ourselves that we have a responsibility, a commitment to knowledge and not to numbers. I really don't think that this game is worth playing. And I think that the only position that has integrity is to refuse it. And I should end with a caveat to say that we are all complicit. None of us have been able to refuse it completely. If there are any academics on this call, we all to some extent play the game. But let's at least be aware of that and try and reduce the extent to which we are manipulated by a bunch of nonsense numbers and instead recommit to knowledge. And that is that.
Thank you very, very, very much. That was fantastic. We are now going to move over to the Q&A because I see there is one already pending. So we have a question for you, Sue, from Sue Murray of AGEL, who asks, what is the single most simple, most persuasive method to awaken African university administrators and national policymakers who are still stuck believing that the impact factor and scopus are core to research output quality? How do we, as African journal editors or as AGEL or as any person interested in making sure that African research contributes to African development, how do we do this? How do we reach these senior policymakers and national funders?
Thanks.
It's a long one.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, it's not just a long one. It's one to which there is no lovely answer that I can give. It's a complicated one. I think we have to approach this from multiple fronts, and I think that many of you already are. There isn't just sort of a simple solution. I think that Diamond Open Access journals might, and they're always working off these tiny budgets. I mean, I made that facile comment about, you know, the offices of Elsevier compared to your offices. So it's not like you've got money to throw at this problem, but I do think that perhaps collectively we need to just speak up and speak proudly. I think, and I might be completely wrong in this, you can push back if you think I am, I think that places like AGEL might feel a little bit like they shouldn't be pushing to or being too outspoken about how corrupt the journal impact factor system is, how much nonsense, how much it privileges a global north publishing industry, because I think they might feel, who are we to make such strong comments, or that we might be accused of self-interest, that we're only saying this because, you know, we get jobs from doing a different model. And I think that's a big mistake. Clarivate certainly doesn't have any concerns about selling us their own system. So the first thing I think is for the editors to be big and bold and brave, but much more I want to speak to the academics, for all of us to take you know, to ask ourselves questions. Who are we doing reviewing for? Who are we doing editing for? Who are we, where are we publishing? And to bring these conversations to our senates, to our research committees, and if possible, nationally. I also think that perhaps we need more publications on this issue of publication. So maybe we need a few special issues on the corruption of big academic publishing. And yeah, I think it's about keeping the conversation alive. I'm outspoken on this issue. I don't think everyone feels they can be. But even if we can at least raise a few questions, even if we aren't willing to say this is absolute nonsense that's been bought into, then at least let's ask questions in whatever platforms we can.
Fantastic. Keeping the ball in the AGEL court. Oh, no, wait. We have a question from the floor. Sorry, I will circle back to that one. Sorry, I have a, what does it cost? You mentioned the costs of rejecting a ranking. What are those costs? Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think the costs are quite as high for places like Yale and Harvard, and I called them big boys, and I did that intentionally as a good feminist. I'm not using the gender unwittingly. I think that it doesn't cost them much because they are pretty secure in their reputations. That's what's actually been so good about places like that withdrawing, and it's not the whole of Harvard and the whole of Yale, by the way. It's just their law and medical faculties. It doesn't cost them much, but it does cost a place like Rhodes a lot. What's been great is places like the Sorbonne and Utrecht and Stillman College, which are certainly a lot more high status perhaps than Rhodes University, but are nonetheless not the huge high status perhaps as some of the others. It's been great that they've also come out and said, no, they won't participate anymore because it leads to gaming, because it is neo-colonial in nature, because it's unscientific. I mean, I said in an article once that an honors student who made up the methodology for university rankings would not get their honors at Rhodes University, because we'd very quickly demonstrate to the student why it's unscientific to give proxy measures that are so far away from the thing that they purport to represent, to add together composite averaging of completely discrete numbers, and then to have very arbitrary weighting of those numbers. So to finally get to your question, what does it cost? Well, it costs privilege and status. A lot of the general public think that rankings tells you about quality. So when they're choosing, when a parent is choosing a university for their child, they don't realize that many of the rankings, almost all of the rankings are almost entirely about research output. Some of the rankings are 100% about research output. They don't realize the extent to which you need to find a university that matches your child's disciplinary needs, their desired study, their personality, where they will fit in, what kind of university. They will look at that number and think, aha, this means good quality. And so the biggest cost is that is in terms of choice of university. It was a few years ago a big cost in terms of funding, because there were some funding agents that wanted to make sure that whatever universities, if you were looking for partners in research projects, that they came from universities that were recognized in various ranking industries. But that luckily seems to have largely abated. And so there is less of that, but it did have implications for that, for who got money and how much money you got. So I think those are very real costs.
Thank you very, very much. We have another question, and unfortunately a pop-up is blocking the name of the attendee who is asking it. I do apologize, but the question is, do any of the rankings take into account do any of the rankings take into account student support measures that exist within an institution?
Very few of them, and none of the big ones. So there are some. Many of them just wait for someone to mute. There we go. There are a few that do look at things like ratio of staff to student. I don't think that's a very good proxy for quality. You can have a class of 20 and a useless lecturer. And again, at least that particular metric for what is meant to be about student support of staff to student ratios is quite easy to game. So we do see a lot of universities accounting guest lecturers as lecturers, and playing games around how you classify your staff. Are they researchers? Can you count them in the staff to student ratio? So every metric has an interesting gaming version of it. Increasingly, there are attempts like Weber metrics or the attempts to make rankings available where you can select the weighting and what to include and what to exclude, which metrics to include and exclude. In the end, the problem comes down to the exact same one, though, and that is that that the numbers are completely discrete activities in a very complicated social structure like the university, and you're adding completely, you're adding apples and pears and ending up with oranges, if that metaphor works. So a lot of it also homogenizes universities. So rankings value, as I said, almost primarily around publications is the biggest one. Some will then look at which quintile those publications are in, Nobel Prize winners and other field medal winners, which is why we have this crazy situation with 4 universities in Europe all arguing about where Albert Einstein is a graduate from, So it has these very silly metrics. And so a real metric of, does this university care about its community? How does it engage with its community? Those are things that are not easily turned into a number. And metrics work by taking a social phenomenon and turning it into a single number. And actually, the really important stuff that counts in a university, you can't turn that into a number. But a publication, so nice and easy, you can count them. So no, the answer, that was a long answer. The short answer is no, they are not institutions that really give you a detailed account of student support.
Sound. That sounds like something that should be taken under careful consideration. Right, we have another question. What is the incentive for Chinese authors, for example, to flood journals outside of China with submissions, even regional journals? What's going on there?
Yeah, that's a nice question. China, like Russia, have set national targets in the rankings. So they are, China's higher education system is just booming, and I don't want anyone to mistake what I'm saying as entirely negative. I think we are seeing cutting edge research coming out of China because they are investing as a country so much in their universities. So we are getting incredible research work coming out of China that we perhaps as a sector just didn't really anticipate. And part of that is this massive investment. But of course, with that kind of investment and increased focus on research has come gaming. And unfortunately, the Chinese government and the Russian government have put targets to universities around rankings, and rankings reward publications. They've also got national level legislation around promotion criteria that speak to publications. So yeah, there you have it. It's a political government decision.
Just continuing off that question from me is like, is it possible for anywhere else to offset that, or not really? That sounds quite difficult to withstand almost.
Yeah, I don't know. I certainly feel pretty powerless in the face of that. But just to hold on to the optimism, I am a bit of a Pollyanna as well, is to say, but we do have agency within our own activities and within our own universities, or indeed, if you're in the publishing house. We do have agency to participate in and shape the conversations there. So no, I have no power over what the Chinese government does, but I can participate in conversations about within my own university, and to try and make sure that we're not naively saying, yay, we must do whatever it takes to do better in rankings, and yay, we must do whatever it takes to get more publications.
Thank you. We have a verbal question coming in. Basi Asukwo, you can go ahead. Or you would be able to go
unmuted.
Okay, I'm sorry, we can't take the verbal question. Please do pop it into the chat. We have a question from Alem Tehe Sise, and who says, in your presentation, impact factor seems like academic politics. So do you mean that we do not work for the impacts through our publications?
Yeah, okay, that's a really important question. Journal impact factor is very different to impact. Journal impact factor is about how many articles from that journal get cited or referenced by how many people. And of course, you want people to read your article, and you want people to find your articles so important and so useful in their field that they draw on it when they make their own contribution. And so, of course, chasing citations makes sense if you understand that as a metric of making an impact in the field. But when we only understand impact as citations, then it's very easy to game citations, right? Self-citations, journal editors requiring citations, little cabals of group citations. So we see that happening with the journal impact factor. And so I don't want to collapse my critique of the journal impact factor with critique of impact. If your journal article can make a difference in the world, can be useful to other researchers, can help solve society's problems, can help build answers to a concern, that's impact. The problem is that citations are only one kind of impact. Now, the research excellence framework in the UK have tried to have a bit more nuance. So it's not just the journal impact factor, it's not just the citations of your individual articles. It's saying, are your findings being used by communities? Have you run workshops on your findings? Have you published in the popular press about your research? Have you developed a poster for a health clinic in a rural area? Try and put together a portfolio of impact of your research beyond just citations. But even that, unfortunately, is being gamed. So their attempt to make things more holistic. I was sitting in a meeting not very long ago in the UK, and someone said, oh, sorry, we forgot to take photos. Can you all just sit down again and pretend you're working so we can take some photos? And I'm like, okay, cool, maybe for a report for their webpage or something. I said, no, it's for ref. We've got to include our photographs to show that we've had impact. And it just made me giggle about how performative this whole thing has become. Did I answer the question? I can't remember.
I think so.
Okay.
Right, we have time for, we have a few more. We have time for a few more. South Africa, says Nati Mndondo. South Africa has a differentiated higher education system. Some universities, such as the Universities of Technology, are still wanting to be part of the ranking agenda. So what would you advise since you're proposing rejecting the metric system?
Hi, Nati. I know Nati well. We used to work together many years ago. Well, not that many years ago. Yes, Nati, you're quite right. We have a differentiated system, and I would argue that the focus on H indices, impact factors, journal impact factors, and university rankings is causing untold problems for that. We have a differentiated system that's differentiated through a racialized past and has led to a very unequal present. But we need differentiation in terms of having different institutions that provide different niche programs, that have a different ethos, that attend to different problems, that have their own missions and visions. And so that form of differentiation would arguably be a very good thing. But rankings and impact factors actually flatten because they want to have a homogeneous, we should all be the same. We should all be Oxford. And that's what you should be aiming towards. Don't spend energy, don't spend time, don't spend money on community engagement or trying to make sure that you've got engaged research. Just get the things that count. So I would argue that this differentiated system into which we are pulling these silly games is being made worse because we're playing these games. And we can see that through how uneven predatory publication is in South Africa. So we've got a couple of institutions in South Africa that have very rapidly gone up the rankings, where simultaneously have got a really high level of predatory publications. So in the push to say you have to, as your performance management, you have to have 2 publications, 3 publications, 4 publications this year, you won't get promoted without it. We don't care what you publish, where you publish, what impact it has, just get it published. Obviously, we have a load of nonsense. We have a load of pressure on, we've got PhD students. You can't graduate if you don't publish. Yes, you're not ready to say anything meaningful. We don't care, just get it published. So we have these unintended consequences. So predatory publication is one of them. And we see a massive increase of predatory publication in South Africa. And it is coming from particular universities. Is very uneven. And the other thing we've got increasingly is ghost affiliations. So we've got a number of universities, I won't mention them by name, but we've got a few universities in South Africa who pay for publications. So they will approach academics who are not doing research in South Africa. They don't care about research in South Africa. They've maybe never even been in South Africa. And if you put our university as one of your affiliations on your publication, we will pay you 40,000, 50,000. We'll pay for you to come and have a trip and have some wine tasting in South Africa, because we'll get the subsidy from the government if it's one of your affiliations as our institution, and we'll go up in the rankings. And so we see this very perverse, it's called ghost affiliations, we see this perverse practice happening more and more. I gave a talk on rankings at a conference in Luxembourg, and after the session, he obviously didn't want to put up his hand. During the session, someone came up to me, a very well-known academic who's on the up and up. He's young, but he's doing incredibly well. And he said he was approached. He got an email from a vice chancellor at a South African university, and he'd never been to South Africa, saying that they were very interested in his work and they thought it was amazing, and would he be interested in having a research associate position and putting that institution's name on his publications. And he was initially charmed. When he dug a bit deeper, they started promising him money. And yeah, we are seeing this happening. So taxpayers aren't just paying for rubbish publications, they're paying for maybe good quality publications that are being produced outside the country and have got nothing to do with us. And some guy living in a John Dolo and going to a spaza shop and buying his food for the night is actually subsidizing this nonsense, because it is his VAT, a proportion of his VAT that is being used to pay for this.
And on that staggering thought, which, I mean, that is, we really must do something about the system. On that thought, we are running out of time. I want to thank Sioux McKenna so much for this incredibly interesting and wonderful presentation and talk this afternoon, which I think we have all thoroughly enjoyed and learned from. Just to remind everybody, it will be available for those of you who have colleagues or friends that would be interested but have not been able to attend. This will be available via our YouTube channel in full. And I'm hoping we will be able to circulate the slides, but we will talk about that separately. So thank you very, very much to all who attended. Thank you to Professor McKenna, and thank you to Susan Murray for introducing us. Right, thank you very much, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm now going to stop the recording.
Bye-bye, and thank you.